What if the story you've been living your whole life wasn't actually the truth?
What if it was just a set of old beliefs created years ago that are still running the show today?
I'm Victoria.
And I'm Milt.
And this is Rewrite Your Story, the podcast where we explore how the narratives in your head shape your life
and how you can begin rewriting them with clarity, compassion, and tools you can actually use.
Let's dive in. Welcome back. How are you doing today, Milt?
I am doing okay. If you're going to hear a little bit of clicking, it's because I have my fidget. And if I don't have my fidget, I'm not as good. I don't know if you remember, we did a survey of our office. And one of the things that we got in the comments was
that you fidget all the time.
Milt should work on his fidgeting before he works on helping other people, because clearly he's not ready to be a therapist yet.
Which I thought was it's so interesting
funny.
because if you didn't fidget, you wouldn't be able to focus. That's just how you operate in a sense, right? And it helps.
But it's also okay to recognize, that's one of the good things about therapy is it's okay to recognize if I'm going to bug you while we're sitting in therapy, then I'm not your therapist.
That is so true. One of the things that I've had to learn with the coaching aspect of it is I'm not for everyone. And having to be okay with that was so hard because I want to help people, right? And I want to help anyone that asks for help. And so getting that part of myself to recognize that's not possible, it's not realistic. And it's better if the person that I'm working with, the client that I'm working with, and me are being actually genuine and authentic to ourselves for progress to be made versus trying to fit the mold that I think that they need. Because then it's not, you don't get that authenticity. And I feel like it can be harmful too.
Well, and I think that's kind of the problem. One of the things in the mental health space is that you don't always have a lot of options. Sometimes you're stuck with what you get. Whereas because there is a plethora of doctors, I can choose who I want to go see for my primary and choose who fits with me best. In reality, what benefits people the most is resonance.
Yeah.
Now, not that you should run away from everyone you don't resonate with, but the idea of asking, what is it about that person that causes me to not resonate? What is it that comes up in my head? And how am I paying attention to that? Because that can answer the questions of do I feel like this connection is working or do I feel like it's not working? And if it's not working, what's going on to make it not work?
Yeah. And is it fear of they're challenging me too much and I'm not ready yet? Or is it an actual just there's not a mesh, there's not that connection? And
if your judgment says, I am more casually dressed, I wear my newsboy hats, I sometimes show up in shorts and flip-flops. If your system can't take me for me, and you need someone who's serious and buttoned down and all those things, and your system says that's the only way I can hear advice or hear therapy, then that's okay. Then we're okay with that. And so there is value in looking at those things, even if the judgment's not necessarily applicable. It doesn't matter.
Mhm.
What matters is, do you find the person that's going to help you heal the best? You know, and so the idea that they have to resonate with me is also one of those things. It's nah, they don't. And on top of it, I don't necessarily want to change who I am either.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of a lead-in to look at what we did. We created a whole lead-in to talk about what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah. So today we were intending to talk about our first pillar, which is learn, right? So last week we talked about how we're in the process of developing this new model, the SAS model, self-alignment structure system. We're still throwing it out there.
System is where we're landing.
Where we're landing. Okay. So we finally have the official.
Well, because if I change it, my friend who's helping me will kill me. So I'm not allowed to change it anymore. Self-alignment system.
So yeah, we were intending to talk about our first pillar, which is learn. We have the 4, which is learn, heal, grow, strengthen, and then the overall essence of radical acceptance. We got into talking about what is the purpose of learn? How do we want to explain that to people? And how do we want to explain to those who are listening, what makes this different, especially from DBT, since that is the foundation we have been using for so long.
Or parts work or anything like that.
Yeah, and how in dialectical behavior therapy, there's the modules, right? There's the interpersonal effectiveness, there's the emotion regulation, and then there's the stress tolerance. And within those modules, there's the skills, right? And then when we are going through them, when we're teaching those, it can feel pretty confining in a way of like, well, the distress tolerance skills are only used when I'm in crisis, and the emotion regulation skills are only used when I am feeling heightened or when I'm feeling upset or whatever it might be. And the IE ones are only used for when I'm communicating with other people. And just before we were talking about how with our model, it's recognizing we don't have to be in these very specific situations. And I don't think it's necessarily like these are the only times that you can use these skills, but that's how we perceive it. And that's how we then utilize them. And we're trying to get to a point where it's not about you have to be in the specific situation. It's about becoming aware of and mindful of when you're in a certain state of being. And that's where we're going to head off for today.
Yeah, so we're going to introduce some concepts from the polyvagal theory. And Victoria just mentioned something really important. We're in this sort of phase of unlearning. And it's kind of cool. Speaking of states, like we're trying to go into this unlearning state so that we can create this model in the best way possible. Some of that requires us to let go of what we know and let go of what our natural instincts are. As we're referencing old models, not that they're wrong and bad, because we're going to continue to
Yeah.
reference those models. In fact, we intentionally built this model to be an agnostic model. It's not a mindfulness based model. It's more of a stages of development. So if we're really looking at how we want to define this, we're giving people the entire map so that you can develop from where you are to where you want to get to. It's more of a map than it is anything else, but it's a map that points you into different states so that you can recognize the most effective state to continue moving towards what you're aiming for. And in order to do that, we have to understand how states develop. So we're going to talk about the polyvagal theory. So the polyvagal theory addresses a part of our nervous system called the polyvagal nerve, or a set of nerve clusters. And don't get me wrong, I'm not an expert on this. I've done some trainings on it. I have the most caveman understanding. Okay, so we're talking about the polyvagal theory. And these nerve clusters are part of our emotional information system. It's how we know how to go into fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or whatever state they come up with down the road. These states are survival states. And as much as we like to use words to describe emotions and whatnot, our brain doesn't actually use those.
Right.
We've added words to them to say fear looks like this, depression looks like this, happy looks like this. Our brain didn't care. We've
Yeah.
added context, and that context then gives me and you a way to share an idea so that we're talking about similar things at least. The point of the different nerve clusters in this is to move us to those different states. The interesting thing about states, though, is that typically what we learn in the state that we're in is the only, we have to go back to that state to re-access that skill. So, for example, I grew up in a house that was super, super anxious. My mom was very outwardly anxious, and my dad was very inwardly anxious. So we didn't think my dad was anxious because he was one of those that like pushed it all down. But in reality, he was just as anxious as my mom. It's just he was able to show a better face. My mom, however, was very much, out there with her anxiety. So that was the state of my home. So that means that my body learned how to function in this anxious state.
Mhm.
Now, I also have ADHD. And so when you took me from my home, this anxious state that was where I learned how to talk, where I learned how my manners work, where I learned how to engage with people, all of my life skills, I then go to this state called school. And school is not my home.
Right.
It's not my friends' houses. It's not where I've played. It's not anything. I have an expectation to play while I'm out there. I have an expectation to learn while I'm out there. But nothing in school felt like my home
Mhm.
except recess, because that was chaotic time.
Right.
Because if you ever watched kindergartners and first graders and second graders play, it's like
It's a
little
fever
gremlins
dream.
running around. I mean, I just keep thinking of like, the giant horde of gremlins.
Honestly, and actually playing with them as an
Yeah.
adult, it was so hard to keep up all the time. I'm like, "Wait, you just said," and what? Yeah, all over the place.
And it's great. It's so much fun, right? Because
Oh,
there's
yeah.
no constraints on their creativity, and that chaos is just awesome for them.
Yeah.
But they don't necessarily know that they're being chaotic. They just know that they're playing.
Yeah.
But then they go back into the classroom and they were supposed to sit still, and they were supposed to learn. And when the teacher's talking, they're silent and they're supposed to sit still. And all of these things, and not one of those things made any sense to me, nor was it the natural state that I functioned in. So you've got your baseline biological state, right? Like, so in my case, having ADHD, it's going to change the way that my body behaves in everyday world. And then also coming from this environment of heavy anxiety, my body did not know how to work in that state of classroom. And so I started getting labeled troublemaker. I started getting labeled problem child. I started getting all of these things. And so now this classroom is starting to teach me that I'm a problem.
Right. Your
So,
disruptance.
yeah. And so now my body is learning to say, okay, in this state, I'm a problem.
Mhm.
Well, I know how to be a problem. I'm really good at being a problem because that felt more natural to me. At home, I wasn't getting in trouble, but at school, I was. And I didn't know how to learn the way they were working with me.
Right.
So I couldn't achieve the goals that they set out for me. And I was labeled a problem because I couldn't conform. Now, being 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, I didn't ever understand that the problem was not me as much as it was the state that I came from learning was not the same as school.
Right.
And so if you think about this, how it works in all of these situations in life is that we learned how to function differently in every state of our life.
Mhm.
At some point, take someone who is autistic. One of the things that autistic people tend to do is called mimicking or parroting. Well, in parroting and mimicking, what you're doing is you're looking around and saying, okay, I don't want to respond the way that I respond because the way that I respond seems to be getting a negative reaction.
Mhm.
So then they're going to start looking and saying, how do other people respond? But here's where it gets complicated for people who have autism is they start using that response, but they think that that's the same response you're supposed to use all the time.
That generalization piece.
No one ever told them that this is the response for this situation, this state, and not this state.
Mhm.
And so then they get more confused because they don't know what to do. That's why we're creating the model that we're creating. We're not trying to create a specific guideline or process for you to follow. In fact, what we're trying to get you to do is understand how, when you're in a certain state, you have certain access to certain skills. And if you can figure out how to function in that state the most optimally, the most effectively, then you're going to maximize the benefit of that state, which means you could be bouncing around from state to state all the time. But if you don't understand what state you're in and what skills you have available to you at that state, you're not going to know how to make the progress that you need. Tell me what of this is making sense and what is not making sense, because I want to make sure it's clear.
I think it makes sense. I wonder if it makes sense because I'm familiar with this. So I guess clarifying or helping, our listeners try to identify what state is their baseline, right? Because, like you said, our states are so unique to our upbringing, to what we've been exposed to, like those kinds of things, right? And so it's going to look different for everybody. Even if we use the same descripting word, it's still unique to each individual, because my calm is different from your calm. My
Yeah.
anger is going to be different from your anger. And so, how can we identify what our baseline is, like what we tend to go to versus what then takes us into looking at the polyvagal theory, like the window of tolerance, what takes us from that green zone, which is our baseline, our normal.
The best zone for us to function in. It's
Yes.
where we're able to access our entire array of emotions in that green zone. We probably should break down the window of tolerance. The window of tolerance is this theory that has red, green, and blue zone. The red zone is your fight or flight zone. The blue zone is your freeze zone. And then the green zone is where you're able to access all your emotions and all your talents and all your skills. And theoretically, that's where you're in a state of appropriate awareness and appropriate calmness. And I say appropriate because there's never a time where we should be unaware.
Right.
Because our body says, if I'm unaware, I'm food for someone else.
Vulnerable.
I'm vulnerable. That's the word. If, however, I'm slightly aware, the analogy that I've used before in the past is the difference between the red zone and the green zone. The red zone, you're functioning like a smoke detector. The green zone, you're functioning like a watchtower. A smoke detector detects smoke, not fire, not danger, not anything else. It detects smoke. Well, smoke doesn't always mean bad, but a smoke detector doesn't care. If there's smoke, its job is to alert you.
Yeah.
So we've all had the experience of where we're cooking something on the stovetop and it's too smoky. We got the pan too hot, or we're burning something, or you're cooking bacon because bacon has just a really high smoke point. The smoke goes off and it gets stuck. Like, I have a hallway in my house where a smoke detector is at the end of this hallway. And so when the smoke goes down this hallway, it gets trapped there. And so now the smoke detector says there is now enough smoke for me to set off the alarm. Because at this level of smoke, it's supposed to be dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't care if it's actually dangerous or not. It just knows that smoke is there. That's the fight or flight state. We're not actually assessing danger. We're just trying to get safe.
Yeah.
Because the alarm went off and now we're supposed to respond. We're supposed to fight or run.
Yeah.
The problem is smoke detectors don't give us a lot of information, and they're useful only when we don't have the ability to discern. 2 a.m, I don't have time to think. If the smoke detector is going off, theoretically, I'm not cooking bacon. Theoretically, I'm not doing something in my house that projects smoke down the hallway.
Yeah.
So that means that smoke's coming from potentially a dangerous place. And so at that moment, it's very useful information that smoked alarm absolutely works. At 9 o'clock in the morning, when I'm cooking the bacon, the smoke detector is useless. But if I don't know how to distinguish between 9 o'clock in the morning and 2 o'clock, because again, what I grew up in was going back to that anxious thing, then that state of anxiety is constantly there. Then anything that triggers anxiety or prompts anxiety in me is going to say, my smoke detector is going to say, smoke, 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 danger, 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 danger. A watchtower functions differently. A watchtower says there's smoke. We should take a look at that. A watchtower, I'm a very old school vision guy, so I'm into fantasy and all that kind of stuff. So in my head, I see a watchtower and I think of medieval times where knights are coming up to the castle at night.
Right.
Yeah. Or the, Lord of the Rings when they're, the hobbits are going to free. And they're knocking on the gate so they can get in. The job of the watchtower is to determine if that is a dangerous person or not. It's supposed to ask questions. It's supposed to make assessments. At 2 a.m, I don't want to make assessments. At 2 a.m, I want to be safe. Throughout the rest of the day, I need an okay system to make and ask questions.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what the watchtower state is. So we should never be off guard, but it doesn't mean we have to be so on guard that everything is dangerous.
Yeah.
And then the free state is very similar. Anything that causes danger, The fight, flight, or freeze is just the response. It's not the actual smoke detector itself. When the smoke hits, I either go into fight, flight, or I go into freeze, into that blue zone or the red zone. And when I go into the blue zone, I'm starting to freeze up and prepare to die. In the fight or flight, I'm trying to get ready to try to stay alive as best I can with whatever means necessary. Fighting and flighting is staying alive. Freezing is preparing to die.
Yeah.
So if we look at it that way, then we start to understand the state that I'm in fight and flight and the skills that I have access to are about survival. Well, that means that I could try to learn how to be rational and reasonable and logical, but is that going to stick in fight and flight?
Right.
And if I'm preparing to die in the freeze zone, do I care about rationality?
No, you've
I
accepted your fate.
I care about either getting through this moment or being as peaceful as I can as I go through this hard moment.
Yeah.
That's still making sense.
Yeah, that's definitely still making sense. I think a straightforward way that we will describe it sometimes too is when we're in that red zone, we're very hyper aware, right? And we're very so like thinking it's October, right? And you're walking through a creepy old house. Any creak that you hear or any scuttle you hear, you are right there. You're aware, right?
That's a great example because think about the state you choose as you walk into a creepy house.
Mm-hmm.
You're putting your mind in a state of what should I be scared of?
Right. And in that moment, it's going to be everything. When we're in that hyper awareness, that's again where the fight, flight, or freeze is going to come in. Right. And that's where it kicks in. And that's the difference between that hyper aware versus baseline regular awareness. And hopefully, we're always in that awareness aspect. It's just, are we overly aware or hypo aware and not paying attention to our surroundings?
We're trying to
And
put ourselves to sleep and ignore the danger because
yes.
we're just trying to get through. A really awful example of this, and this is why lots of people really judge themselves. If they're going through a very, very serious event, someone firing a gunshot, someone sexually getting assaulted or raped, there's a lot of times where you go into fawn and or freeze response. And people judge themselves really harshly in freeze response because they think they should be fighting.
Mm-hmm.
When in reality, your system did the analysis really quickly and said, I can't stop this from happening. I
Right.
need to go to a different place in my head or in the world or in reality until this awful moment is over with.
100%.
Like people have used the analogy of, I didn't even realize I was screaming. And then I heard someone screaming and then I realized, oh, that's me.
That's coming
And
from,
that's what,
yeah.
yeah, that brings them back to reality
Yeah.
because they had to freeze to get through that moment. Well, that means that the skills they have access to are very, very, very limited. And so the fact that they judge themselves for using that skill is really interesting because no, you got through the moment. It's just that you're not comfortable that you weren't able to stop the bad thing from happening to you. You
Yeah.
know, it's a very disempowering state. And then think about other times that you felt disempowered and how that brings you to a very specific state.
Mhm. Yeah.
So maybe the bridge to what we're trying to get to is we developed this model, this learn, heal, grow, strengthen with the whether it's the roof or whether it's the floor that gets you to each one, or it's just the pathway that you follow. We're asking you to look at what state you're in and is it the wisest state to be in?
Right.
And so every time we use these states, we're going to try to look and say, okay, what state is optimal to be in right now? In DBT, they have a skill called being and doing mind. This would probably be an explanation of what being and doing mind is for. You could make an argument that learning is more of a being experience. In being mind, there's certain traits, and in doing mind, there's certain traits. And one of the things that we struggle with is how do we use the mind states properly? Because American culture is one of doing.
All the time.
We talk about everything from the standpoint of how do we fix things? How do we make things better? In fact, that's probably where most of our conflict comes from is that we're always in this state, or almost always in this state of doing something. Because if you're
Yeah.
ever just being, that's lazy.
Exactly. Yeah.
So in internal family systems, they would call that a generational trauma or a cultural belief that's kind of pushed on everyone, and it's not exactly accurate. And so when you look at these states, a lot of people would look at learning and say, well, yeah, that's where I should always be. But have you actually considered that learning sometimes needs to happen in a being state? That one of the best learnings we can do is to just be still and meditate.
Yeah. That
And
reflection piece almost, do you think? Or do you think that's still
it's a
too much?
skill. It's definitely a skill to develop, right? Because you learn how to reflect properly, then you can actually make an honest assessment of the situations, and then you can move forward and make better progress in life. And then again, we look at a healing state as more of a being state, but it isn't always a being state. I don't always have to just stand around to get better. I have to sometimes be to get better. I sometimes have to learn how to integrate all the things that have happened to me, but I also have to learn how to do things. And so we're almost saying, get away from what you think the standard is, move away from what you think learning is, and understand what your body feels like when it's in a learning state, how it
Yeah.
resonates with growing, how it resonates with strengthening, just maintaining. Because maintenance is one of the hardest things. It's so boring to do the same thing every day and think that that's what gets me to my long term goals, when in reality, it does. And how to learn how to accept reality for what it is and how to act after you've accepted. So there's the being side and the doing side. And so all of these states, learn, heal, grow, strengthen, with a capstone of radical acceptance, they're all going to have a being and doing component. And we're going to have to figure out, which state do I need to shift to so that I can integrate what I need to integrate into my life? Because if I'm always in a learning state, then I'm ignoring the other ones. And so going back to my elementary school experience, I never integrated what learning looked like. I integrated what troublemaking looked like. So guess what state I get into every time I enter a classroom?
Troublemaker.
Class clown, make people laugh. And so I've had to battle exiting that state and actually being in a resonance with learning,
And
which
that
is
being
not.
aspect of learning.
Yep.
Yeah.
One of my favorites is one of our skills coaches, Christina. When she was doing DBT, she would come and set her binder out. And she was the best student, and she would take every note. And I finally had to tell her one day, close your binder. And she's like, what do you mean? I said, you're not going to learn like a student today. Today, you're going to just let it flow into you and see what happens. But the problem is, even in our hero movies, they're always like Karate Kid. I just watched the newest version of that on our flight. And even in that state, where he's learning this skill of waxing the car, and then that turned into him being able to block punches or kicks, we still function as if it's supposed to lead towards something.
Mm-hmm.
What if the skill was just waxing the car and it never was actually about punching or blocking a punch? And so if we don't properly figure out what I need to be or do in the state that I'm in, I'm never going to integrate the state fully. And then when do I need to go back into the different states so that I become the best version of me? Throughout the day, when I screw up, am I going to a healing state so that I can heal me and hopefully heal the person that I screwed up with? Am I open to the state of learning so much that when someone says something, I write that down? That's an important idea. I really want to integrate that. Like, am I open to all of those? That's the generalization side of this. We're trying
Yeah.
to become a person who constantly develops.
Right.
And that requires us integrating all those states.
Yeah. So with that, because we talked about before how in the United States, the societal norm, right? Like the cultural norm is to constantly be doing. So I guess how do you see, people applying our model and applying this idea of being okay with just being when it comes to especially the more active pillar, like the more quote unquote active pillars of learning, right? How does that become something that happens of like recognizing and I mean, obviously, it's gonna have to come down to that radical acceptance piece and accepting that we can learn by
Well,
just
actually,
being right now.
I think that's a perfect lead in to us setting up what learning looks like. And so that's the question that I think we should pick up with next time is,
Yeah.
okay, now that we've understood the states, how do we use them? And we're
Yeah.
going to focus on learning, and we're going to focus on kind of a pro and con of the learning state. And so how to use it effectively and ineffectively.
Right.
And I think that's a perfect lead into where we're going to go.
I love it.
Final
Cool.
thoughts?
I'm excited to see what comes from next week. I think I had a lot of reflective moments, especially talking about that idea of there's times to be doing with these states of being, and there's times to be being with these states of being. And so I'm excited to get into that conversation of what the difference is and
Yeah.
when it's effective and when it's not, and how to discern that within myself.
Sometimes it's hard, like, because we're trying, like I said, we're unlearning. And so I'm almost, when I learned Portuguese, I had to almost learn it through English. I would think the English phrase and then I would say it in Portuguese. Until I unlearned my English standards, the Portuguese standards didn't make sense because their
Yeah.
grammar rules are different.
Right.
And it wasn't until I let go of what I knew that I was able to get to the next phase. And
Yeah.
then Portuguese became, something that flowed through me. And then I got back and I had to unlearn Portuguese to learn English. In fact, there was a time where I was teaching some lessons, but I was teaching them to someone who was an English speaker who didn't speak Portuguese very well. He was an exchange student from America. And so I was teaching the lessons that we were teaching, and I was translating from Portuguese back to English. And it was the weirdest thing I've ever done in my life. And I really think that's an important example of like, that's why this model is going to feel a little bit clunky at first, because there's a whole lot of unlearning that we're going to go through and a whole
Definitely.
bunch of rebuilding back up in a different way so that we can be in the state that makes the most sense.
Yeah. I think that being said, though, too, like that's a part of the process of healing and of growing in general. So is unlearning,
Of development, right?
unlearning what we have been told is correct and what we should and shouldn't do, and what we've been exposed to our entire lives, and figuring out what actually works for us.
Yeah. Cool. Awesome.
Thanks, Mel.
We'll pick this up. Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Thanks for joining us for today's episode of Rewrite Your Story. Take a moment to notice what story showed up for you today.
Remember, you're not your story. You're the one holding the pen.
And each moment is a chance to write a new chapter.
Be sure to join us next time as we keep exploring the path towards self-alignment.
We'll see you then.